The Light We Built. Chapter 3. The Shape of an Idea. The radio had gone quiet some time after the music ended. The lamp on the sideboard still burned low, casting a warm circle of light across the dining room table. The rest of the apartment had settled into shadow. Through the window, Maple Street lay quiet beneath the yellow glow of the strut lamp. Noah and Mugrat had finished dancing some time ago, but neither of them had quite felt ready to end the evening. There was a softness to the night that made the ordinary sounds of the house seem almost comforting. The faint tick of the kitchen clock, the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Somewhere in the floorboards, the building shifted gently as the night air cooled the wood. Noah sat at the table with his chair tipped back slightly, long legs stretched beneath it. A pencil rested between his fingers, rolling slowly while he stared at the tabletop without quite seeing it. Across from him, Mugrat had her mending basket open beside her chair. One of Jack's shirts lay across her lap while she worked the needle through a worn seam beneath the arm. The thread whispered softly through the cloth. For a while, the only sound in the room was the steady pull of the needle and the slow turning of Noah's pencil. Then Noah said quietly, "You think they meant it?" Mugrat did not look up right away. She finished the stitch she was working before answering. "Which one?" "All of them." That made her smile. There were quite a few. Yes, there were. The pencil turned again between his fingers. They kept asking the same question. Mugrat lifted her eyes briefly. If the studio was for rent. Yes. She studied his expression for a moment before lowering her gaze back to the shirt. They weren't joking. No. Noah leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "I've heard folks ask plenty of things in that diner," he said. "Directions, weather, where the nearest mechanic is." Mugrat nodded faintly. "But this wasn't like that," he continued. "No, they were thinking about it." Mugrat pulled the thread through and set another stitch. Yes, they were. The quiet returned for a moment. Outside, a breeze stirred the leaves of the maple tree along the street. The branches brushed lightly against one another with a dry whisper. Mugrat tied off the thread and clipped it carefully with the small sewing scissors. "You've been thinking about it all evening," she said. Noah smiled slightly. "I have." She folded the shirt neatly across her lap. "The ground back there is good," Noah continued slowly. "Flat enough to build on, close enough to the road folks could find it easily. That ground grows tomatoes," Mugrat said mildly, "in the summer, and weeds the rest of the year." "That too." They shared a quiet smile. Noah leaned back again, the pencil now resting loosely between his fingers. "You remember those little cabins up by the lake?" Mugrat nodded immediately. "We stayed there once. 3 nights. Her expression softened at the memory. "They had the blue doors and those creaky screen doors." Mugrat laughed quietly. "And the thin walls, very thin walls." She shook her head slightly. But they were always full. That's exactly it. Noah tapped the pencil lightly against the table. People travel through this town every day. Salesmen, farmers hauling produce, families headed somewhere else. Mugrat nodded. They stop for pie. They do, but they don't stay. The thought settled between them. Mugrat smoothed the shirt across her lap, her fingers resting there a moment. How many? She asked. Noah blinked. If you did it, she said. How many cottages? Noah leaned back, gaze drifting toward the ceiling as he pictured the space behind the diner. The gravel lot, the patch of garden, the wide strip of ground stretching toward the trees. 3, he said after a moment. Maybe 3. Mugrat raised one eyebrow. That's already 3 sets of sheets. And 3 sets of guests buying breakfast. That gave her pause. Travelers who stayed the night would wake up hungry. They would walk across the gravel in the morning. They would push open the diner door while the coffee was fresh and the griddle was hot. They would sit at the counter. They would order eggs and bacon and pie. Mugrat placed the shirt carefully into the mending basket. It would change things, she said quietly. Yes, more work. Yes, but also more life, Noah said. Mugrat studied him. You already talked to Pete. I might have mentioned it. You talked to Pete. He had thoughts. Mugrat smiled knowingly. Pete always has thoughts. He says the ground is solid. That sounds like Pete. And that we'd have to run water lines. Mugrat nodded. And electricity. Yes. And if we're digging trenches anyway, Noah began. Mugrat lifted a finger toward him. Noah. He laughed. I didn't say anything yet. You were about to. I was thinking. 3. For now. Noah. 3, he corrected quickly. Mugrat leaned back in her chair. Satisfied. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. Down the short hallway, 2 bedroom doors were closed. Behind one, Jack slept sprawled across his bed, one arm thrown above his head, long legs tangled in the blanket. Behind the other door, Oscar slept curled beneath his quilt, breathing slow and steady. Mugrat listened to the familiar quiet of the apartment. Then she said softly, Jack would want to help build them. Noah smiled. Yes, he would. He's been watching everything you do. I've noticed. Mugrat folded her hands loosely. And Caroline would come watch. Noah chuckled. That girl asks more questions than Pete. She's curious. She's a Dawson. Mugrat smiled. Jack had been doing a very poor job, pretending that Caroline Dawson did not interest him at all. Mugrat noticed the way he stood a little strutta when she came through the door, the way he suddenly found reasons to pass near her booth, the way he forgot what he was carrying. Mugrat stood and carried the mending basket toward the sideboard. You know what this really means, she said. What's that? If people stay the night. She gestured toward the floor beneath them. They'll eat here. Noah's grin widened. That they will. Morning came with the smell of coffee and bacon. The diner filled quickly once the sun crept above the rooftops. The windows caught the light and poured it across the counter and booths in long, warm stripes. Mugrat moved easily behind the counter pouring coffee and sliding plates across the pass-through. Noah worked the griddle while bacon snapped and curled beside rows of eggs. Jack wiped down the booths with careful concentration. Oscar sat at the end of the counter, folding napkins one by one, the way Mugrat had taught him. Each one was carefully squared, each crease pressed firmly. The bell above the door rang. Cold morning air followed the Dawson family inside. Pete stamped his boots lightly by the door before heading for the counter. Lois guided the girls toward their booth. Caroline spotted Jack immediately and lifted her hand in a small wave. Jack tried very hard not to react too quickly. Margaret noticed anyway. "Morning," Pete said, sliding onto a stool. "Morning," Noah answered. Coffee appeared in front of him without needing to ask. Pete took a sip. "Been thinking." Noah glanced over. "That's dangerous." Pete grinned. "About those cottages." Noah wiped his hands on the towel. "Margaret says 3. Pete nodded thoughtfully. "That's sensible. Good. But you should dig lines for 5. Noah laughed. Across the diner, Margaret paused with a plate of toast halfway to the Dawson booth and closed her eyes briefly. Pete leaned forward. "I'm serious." He jerked his thumb toward the back door. "If it works, you'll want more. We're starting with 3. Pete nodded. "3's good." Then he added quietly, "But run the lines." Noah smiled slowly. Across the room, Jack carried a stack of plates toward the Dawson booth. Caroline looked up as he reached the table. "Hi." "Hi." Virginia rolled her eyes. Georgia kicked her feet happily beneath the booth. Jack stood there for a moment before realizing he had stopped moving. Margaret's voice carried across the diner. "Jack." "Yes, ma'am." "Plates." "Yes, ma'am." He set them down quickly and headed back toward the counter. Behind him, Caroline smiled into her coffee cup. At the counter, Pete Dawson and Noah White leaned over the worn surface, discussing foundations, lumber, and water lines, while the diner filled slowly with the sounds of breakfast. And somewhere in the back of Noah's mind, the empty ground behind the diner had already begun to change. In his imagination, the grass was giving way to gravel. 3 small cottages stood in a neat row. Lights glowed in the windows, and in the morning, travelers walked across the yard toward the diner door, following the smell of coffee and bacon rising into the new day.